Brother Tomas opened his eyes to the smell of burnt rubber and chemical rain, and knew immediately that hell had finally claimed him. The last thing he remembered was the forest outside Paris. October 13th, 1307. Running through darkness with the weight of his order's greatest secret strapped to his chest. The arrest warrants had been issued at dawn. King Philip's men were hunting every Templar in France, and Tomas had been chosen to carry the one artifact that could never fall into their hands. The Chronos seal. A relic so ancient that even the Grand Master didn't know its true origin, only that it had been recovered from beneath Solomon's temple, and that the inscription around its edge promised sanctuary to the faithful in their darkest hour. He had pressed it to his heart as the soldiers closed in, whispered the Latin phrase etched into its surface, felt a heat like molten iron spreading through his ribs. Then the world had torn itself apart in a flash of light that tasted like lightning and screamed like 1,000 dying angels. Now he lay on cold, hard ground that wasn't earth. It was smooth, uniform, gray. Above him, the sky was wrong. It glowed with an orange haze that blotted out the stars, and the air carried sounds he had no words for. A distant roar like 1,000 horses galloping on stone. A rhythmic pulsing that seemed to come from the very atmosphere. And beneath it all, a low electric hum that made his teeth ache. Tomas pushed himself to his knees. His white mantle was gone, his sword too, but the leather satchel containing the seal still hung from his shoulder. His chainmail felt impossibly heavy. Every muscle in his body screamed. He looked down at his hands and saw they were shaking, the skin pale and covered in a fine sheen of something that looked like ash but smelled like burning plastic. The alley where he'd appeared was narrow, boxed in by walls that stretched impossibly high. But these weren't castle walls. They were smooth, regular, pierced with dark windows that reflected his face back at him in warped angles. And they glowed. Faint lights behind glass, dozens of them, like captured fireflies imprisoned in the stone. He stumbled forward, one hand braced against the wall, and emerged onto a street that made him forget how to breathe. Carriages moved without horses. They were metal beasts with glowing eyes, roaring past at speeds that would have torn a man apart, and inside them, people sat bathed in blue light, faces slack, staring at nothing. The street itself glowed with painted lines. Everywhere he looked, there were lights, signs that flickered and changed, showing images that moved like living paintings. A woman's face the size of a house, smiling with teeth too white to be human. Words in English, but twisted, abbreviated into meaningless symbols. And above it all, the buildings. Glass and steel towers that clawed at the sky like the fingers of giants, so tall they seemed to pierce the low-hanging clouds. Tomas backed against the wall, his breathing coming in short gasps. This wasn't Paris. This wasn't anywhere he knew. This was impossible. A woman walked past him without looking. She was dressed in strange, tight clothing that would have gotten her branded a harlot in his time, and she was talking to herself, gesturing at the air with one hand while the other held a glowing rectangle to her ear. She didn't see him. None of them did. Dozens of people flowed past like water around a stone, each one absorbed in their own glowing rectangle, their faces lit from below, in ghostly blue, their eyes vacant and distant. He tried to speak, to ask for help, but his throat had closed up. And even if he could have formed words, what would he say? What year is this? Where am I? What happened to the world? A child bumped into him, a boy no more than 10, and finally someone noticed he existed. The boy looked up, took in Tomas's medieval clothing and wild expression, and his face split into a grin. He raised his glowing rectangle and pointed it at Tomas like a weapon. There was a soft clicking sound. Then the boy laughed and ran off, shouting something about cosplay and going viral. Tomas didn't understand the words. He only understood that he was alone in a world that had forgotten him. A world that had moved on without knights, without honor, without God, and had built itself into something bright and terrible and utterly inhuman. He started walking, not toward anything in particular, just away from the crowds, away from the lights and the noise and the crushing certainty that he was 700 years too late for whatever salvation the seal had promised. The streets became quieter as he walked, darker, the buildings lower and more decrepit. The glow of the city faded behind him until he found himself in an area that looked almost like the slums he remembered. Broken windows, graffiti in languages he didn't recognize, the smell of decay and desperation. And that's when the first one found him. She stepped out of the shadows so smoothly that Tomas didn't see her until she was 10 feet away. A woman, or something wearing a woman's shape. She was dressed in black, form-fitting material that seemed to absorb light, and her eyes reflected the street light above like a cat's. But it was her smile that stopped his heart. Too wide, too knowing, like she'd been waiting for him. "Brother Tomas of the Order of the Temple," she said, and her voice carried the accent of no place he'd ever heard. "You're late. We've been watching for you for a very, very long time." He reached instinctively for his sword, found nothing, and settled into a fighting stance with just his fists. "Who are you?" "My name doesn't matter." She took a step closer. "What matters is what you're carrying. The Chronos seal. You need to give it to me." "I don't know what you're talking about." Her smile widened. "You pressed it to your chest 717 years ago and spoke the words of transit. You disappeared in front of 50 French soldiers who spent the rest of their lives in asylums, screaming about demons and fire. The incident was recorded, buried, hidden. But we never forgot. We've been waiting, watching, knowing that eventually you'd arrive. Time is a circle, Brother Tomas, and you just completed yours. You're a demon." His voice was steady now, falling back on years of training. "You speak in riddles and lies. I'm human, more or less." She reached behind her back and produced something that looked like a metal wand with a glowing tip. "But that doesn't matter. What matters is that the seal can't exist in this timeline. Its very presence creates paradoxes, instabilities. People who understand these things call it a chronological contaminant. I just call it dangerous. So I'm going to take it from you, and then I'm going to make sure you never existed at all." She pointed the wand at him, and Tomas threw himself sideways as a beam of light cut through the space where he'd been standing. The brick behind him exploded in a shower of dust and molten stone. He hit the ground rolling, came up running, and didn't look back as more beams cut through the night, illuminating the alley in stuttering bursts of blue-white fire. He ran like he'd run from Philip's soldiers, like his life depended on it, because it did. The woman's footsteps behind him were light, almost casual, as if she knew he had nowhere to go. And she was right. He was a medieval knight in a world of glass and metal and weapons that shot light. He was an anachronism, a ghost, a man who'd already died 700 years ago and just hadn't figured it out yet. But he had the seal, and if she wanted it this badly, then maybe, just maybe, it was worth keeping. He ducked into a building through a shattered doorway, found himself in a space filled with more of those metal carriages, these ones silent and cold. A parking structure, though he didn't know the term. He wove between vehicles, keeping low, his breath echoing in the concrete tomb. Behind him, the woman's footsteps clicked like a countdown. "You can't run forever," she called out, her voice echoing. "This isn't your world anymore. You don't belong here. Everything you knew is dust. Everyone you loved is 7 centuries dead. Give me the seal, and I'll make it quick, painless, a mercy." He didn't answer, couldn't answer, because she was right about all of it except the last part. There was no mercy in erasure, in being unmade. He'd sworn an oath to protect the seal with his life, and that oath didn't expire just because the calendar had run away from him. He found stairs, started climbing, up and up through the structure, his legs burning, his lungs screaming. Behind him, the woman followed, unhurried, inevitable. He burst through a door at the top and found himself on the roof, 6 stories above the street, with nowhere left to run. The city spread out before him like a carpet of lights. Millions of them, billions maybe, a constellation brought down to earth and scattered across the landscape as far as he could see. It was beautiful in a terrible way, proof that humanity had survived. had thrived, had built something magnificent and monstrous in the ruins of everything he'd known. The door behind him opened, and the woman stepped out, raising her weapon. End of a line, Templar. Tomas pulled the seal from his satchel. It was warm in his hands, thrumming with the same energy that had brought him here. The metal was inscribed with symbols that predated Christianity, predated Rome, predated everything. Solomon's temple had been built on older foundations, and those foundations had held secrets that weren't meant for human hands. The seal was one of them, a key to doors that should stay locked. "What is it?" he asked, not because he expected an answer, but because he needed a moment to think. "What does it really do?" The woman hesitated, and in that hesitation, he saw something like curiosity. "You really don't know? My grandmaster said it offered sanctuary. That's all." Sanctuary. She laughed, bitter and cold. "Is that what he told you?" "The seal doesn't offer sanctuary, Brother Tomas. It offers escape. From time. From consequence. From the moment you press it to your heart, you become unmoored from causality. A living paradox. And paradoxes have a way of destroying everything around them. The longer you exist in this timeline, the more unstable it becomes. Reality starts to fray. People die in ways that don't make sense. Events happen out of order. Eventually, the whole thing collapses. You're not a refugee, Templar. You're a plague." He stared at the seal in his hands, at the weight of it, at the warmth. "Then why does it exist?" "Because someone made it. Someone who wanted to break the world. And they almost succeeded, until your order locked it away." She lowered her weapon slightly. "I know what you're thinking. You're thinking you can use it again. Escape to another time. But there's nowhere left to run. Every jump forward makes the damage worse. This is the end of your road. I'm sorry. I really am. But I can't let you destroy everything that comes after you just because you're lost." Tomas looked down at the city, at the lights, at the proof of human persistence spread out like a promise. 700 years of history he'd missed. Wars and plagues and revolutions. The fall of kings and the rise of new orders. The end of his world and the birth of this one. And somewhere in that vast span of time, every person he'd known had lived and died and been forgotten. Except him. He'd been given the one thing every mortal craved and every wise man feared. More time. And it had cost him everything. "If I give you the seal," he said quietly, "what happens to me? You fade. Probably within minutes. Your timeline will reassert itself. You'll die the way you were supposed to die in 1307, running through a French forest with an arrow in your back. It won't hurt. You'll just stop." He nodded slowly, looked at the seal one more time, at the promise it represented, at the lie. Then he held it out to her. "Take it. But answer me one question first." She stepped forward, cautious, like he might snatch it back. "What question?" "Did we matter? The Templars. The oath. The faith. Did any of it mean anything in the end?" She took the seal from his hands, and for just a moment, her expression softened, became human. "You were murdered by a corrupt king and a cowardly pope. Your order was destroyed for politics and greed. But the stories survived. For 700 years, people have argued about what you represented. Honor. Sacrifice. The idea that some things are worth dying for. So yes, Brother Tomas, you mattered. Maybe more than you know." He smiled at that. A real smile. The first one since he'd opened his eyes in this impossible future. "Then I'll take that with me. It's enough." The seal in her hands began to glow. Bright white light that made him squint, that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Tomas felt warmth spreading through his chest. Not burning like before, but gentle, like falling asleep. The city lights began to fade, growing dim and distant, and the sound of the future became a whisper, then nothing at all. His last thought was of the forest, of running through darkness toward a sunrise he'd never seen, of dying with purpose instead of living without it. And then Brother Tomas of the Order of the Temple closed his eyes, and time finally caught up with him. The woman stood alone on the roof, the seal heavy in her hands, watching the space where the night had stood until there was nothing left but empty air and the faint smell of myrrh. Below her, the city continued its endless rhythm. Cars and lights and people living their lives, completely unaware that a ghost from the Middle Ages had just saved them from a paradox they'd never know existed. She turned the seal over in her fingers, felt its warmth, its terrible promise. Then she walked to the edge of the roof and looked down at the 6-story drop to the pavement below. Sanctuary, she whispered to herself. To the night who'd chosen erasure over escape. Maybe he got it after all. And with that, she pocketed the seal and disappeared back into the future, leaving nothing behind but questions that would never be answered and a story that no one would ever believe.